So thank you. All good. Welcome. And appreciate you being here, as I said. And I'm going to start sharing because you had computer problems and had to log back in. Oh, that explains. I was worried. I thought maybe I hit the wrong button, Stella, and had send you away instead of welcomed you in. So it wasn't me. I'm bad enough without any sort of help like that. So I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation, which would assume I know how to do that. It's not a safe assumption. So I do want to provide a warning. This is a bit pedantic. I really want to be modeling the deep analysis that I think is really useful when you're dealing with ed tech, because too often, we've seen far too many examples of people doing, shiny object syndrome, chasing the latest thing. I don't know about you, but I've had enough of going to virtual worlds to see a PowerPoint presentation. I just don't need that. I don't need to see clumsy use of the technology. And I think I was introduced to an approach that I think is useful. And I want to share it with you. And then we're going to sort of workshop that across several things. First thing I want to say is welcome. Thank you for being here. Yay. And there's never not an excuse to try and work cute animals into your presentations, in my opinion. So I'm glad you're here. There's 3 sessions for this. This is the first one. I want to talk about media and devices and sort of blending. Next time, we want to talk about platforms. I want to talk about objects and activity standards. I want to talk about platforms and some overarching technologies. And then, there we go. I want to make sure I have my thing. Trash Panda. I love that. And then in the third session, I want to talk about applications. This is where we get into what people actually do with these technologies. The order is kind of random, but we are starting with some underlying process. So that's what we're doing. And today we're talking about media and devices and blending. And please, there's few enough of us. You can throw things into the chat. You can click your microphones and speak at any point, any questions, because I don't think I threw in any breaks for questions at any point. I'll just try and remember after every slide. So welcome to day 1. This is affordances in media and devices. And so I'll tell you the story. It was actually Bill Gaver, who was one of my fellow grad students, and Don Norman was both of our supervisors. The lab was the Norman Rummelhart lab. It was actually the Lindsay Norman Rummelhart lab, but Lindsay had disappeared. And so some of the grad students were in Dave Rummelhart's, and so some of us were Don Norman students. And Bill Gaver was looking at audio aspects of interfaces. The whole lab was largely doing interface design, but Gaver had found Gibson, not William Gibson, a different Gibson, and I'm blanking on his name, but he was a perceptual psychologist, and he came up with this notion of affordances. And that was sensory clues about how things work. So a table affords setting things on it. But if you slant it, suddenly things don't stay on it anymore. And in fact, this became, so he brought that concept in, and Don cottoned onto it. He got excited about the idea. And in fact, he's really popularized it. So he's generally considered sort of the guru of this version of affordances. But we did interesting things. So one of the things is mapping. And so he created a switch for part of the lab, a set of light switches. So there were all these lights around the lab, and he created a map of the lab and put the switches on that little map. Now, he had it horizontal, and before the switches were put in, one day he went there and he found a coffee cup ring on it. This is not a good thing because electricity and liquids are not a good mix. So what he did is he changed the mounting so that it was mounted at an angle. And so you still had the mapping to the lab and you still had the switches that controlled the lights, but you couldn't put a coffee cup on it anymore. And that's the notion of affordances are clues about the world, and actually then went to the notion of hidden affordances. But first, if you think of your computer interface, scroll bars, you have those little handles to drag up and down. They're designed to look like you can put your finger on it. You actually use your mouse, but they were textured. The original ones had little textures on them that looked like your fingers could touch them. And buttons, clipped similarly, tended to initially be represented with beveled edges and things, so they looked like they actually afforded pushing on. In real world, we have buttons. We have elevator buttons that you are lit up and you can press them, or they light up to show that you have pressed them. They have texture. They have even, oftentimes they'll have underneath the braille so that you could actually feel them and read them even if you were visually challenged. We have lots of clues, but sometimes designers get so clever that they make things invisible, that you aren't aware that this is something you can press or click on, and yet you need to. And in Don's first book, it's now called The Design of Everyday Things, but it originally was called The Psychology of Everyday Things, but he got feedback that people didn't get that. He talked about things like door handles. So you've seen the door handles that have a bar that comes out, down, and back in. And you can grab them. It really affords pulling. But if you just have a plate, you can't pull, you can only push. But people will put those bars on both sides, and you'll push on it, or you'll pull, and it doesn't pull because it only goes one way. And he also talked about shower handles. And when you go through the thinking behind this, the reason I recommend that book to anybody who designs for people is that it fundamentally changes the way you look at the world. You'll never look at a door handle and a shower control the same way again. But he's gotten mad at the interface to these things because nowadays there's a bunch of affordances that are hidden, like 2-finger and 3-finger swipes. How do you know that that's a possibility? How do you know what it'll do? There's no clue. You just have to know. You have to learn this. So they're affordances that are hidden and only really available to people who know about them. Okay, so that's the notion of affordances, and I think it's incredibly useful. But I take it slightly differently. So when I talk about things like virtual worlds and learning management systems and things, I talk about what their fundamental capability is. So let me give you an example. Second Life came out, and everybody, as you may recall, was excited about this. This was a virtual world. You could go in, you could fly around and go to different areas and meet people. And everybody got excited about it. But because I was looking at it from the perspective of affordances, I said, what is unique to this? I never thought you'd hear Second Life again. Yeah, it's still there. Could be James Gibson. Thank you. I haven't been paying attention to chat. So it's inherently 3D. It's immersive. Granted, it wasn't surrounding you like with a headset, but on the screen, you could see and the world changed depending on how you change your perspective. And you could learn to fly in Second Life. And so I thought, well, there's this 3D capability and other people are there social. When you really need 3D and social, that's when it's going to be valuable. And then, as I said, I went to an event hosted in Second Life, and there was somebody doing a PowerPoint presentation up on a screen. I said, this is not what it's for. And I realized, there were technical overheads. It took a reasonable processor. You had to download this special thing. Eventually, my old boss, Joe Miller, went to Second Life and actually made it run in a browser, but originally you had to download this complex piece of software, and it sucked up your processor heavily. And there were cognitive overheads as well. Learning how to fly was actually hard. Learning how to fly was challenging in that world. So there was a lot of overhead to just do a PowerPoint presentation. We already had webinar software at that time. We didn't need to go into an immersive world. It may have been cool, but fundamentally it didn't add anything valuable. And as you know, Second Life got a whole bunch of excitement, and then it collapsed. It now still exists, by the way, but it's being used for some very specific things. And that capability that they brought in, a whole bunch of people created clones specifically for business and things, and they're being used when you need immersion and social. There was a really nice example that actually American, I'm drawing a blank, AFC, it's an insurance company, American Family Insurance, did this thing where there was this house and a tree had fallen on it. It was training insurance adjusters, and a tree had fallen on the house, and your job was to go in and wander around the house and figure out how much, what was the damage from the tree and make an assessment. And it turns out there was some water damage because it rained after it, and you had to assess how much came from the tree and was there any other cause. And if you did go around, you would actually find out there was something wrong with the plumbing, and part of the water damage was not due to the tree, and that was a pre-existing condition. You weren't supposed to do it. And you went in and you did this, and somebody would watch you. So it required the 3D space because you were actually moving around in this house and looking and things. So you really needed the 3D. And it was social because somebody would watch your performance and give you feedback. And it turns out you could do things you couldn't do in the real world, because otherwise, why not just make a house that you could visit? You could actually pull the walls off of the house after you'd made your assessment and see whether you'd gotten it right or wrong based upon actually then being able to pull out and see the plumbing. You had to work just with real world clues until you finished your assessment, and then you could do manipulations you couldn't do in the real world to get feedback about how well you really did. So that was a case where the affordances were unique, and also people were doing it to train complex facilities like an oil refinery, where conceptually you saw it this way, these are all the pieces, but in the real world they were remapped to fit into the physical constraints. This was something that Ed Holland and Jim Hutchins had done for steamship power plants. Steamships, there's a boiler and there's a condenser and there's turbines, but the way they fit them into a ship means that don't look like they look in the nice diagram. And people were seeing the diagram and seeing the ship and not making the connection. So they did this incredible immersive training way back on interactive DVDs, video discs. But now you could do it in Second Life. But it's that way of thinking, of getting to the core. You may have heard the hoary old story of how new technologies are used like the old technologies. And the cliche is, when people first had TV, the first thing they used it for was to film two people speaking into microphones, which is what they had done with radio. All they did was film radio was the first use of TV. But if you'd understand the affordances, you might have been able to leapfrog it. And that's the thinking, that analysis, that breaking it down into fundamentals that, to me, gives you the ability to predict what things are going to be useful for and what not. Like VR, like AI, if you break it down into what it can and can't do, it gives you a leverage to make smart assessments of technology. And that's really the approach I want to take as we go through these things over the 3 sessions. So are there any questions on that? We begin. We're going to do some examples of this type of thinking as we go along. But before that, any questions? They ignore the perception of depth in TV, so everything is flat. Interesting. in the academic world. I remember an onboarding program in Second Life, supposedly to showcase the tech and cutting nature of the learning in the organization, actually try and bring down onboarding costs. And it was marvelous with no extraneous load at all, none. Surprisingly, it was discontinued. Wonder why? I don't know, Prakar. That's a really interesting question. One of the things you could do is actually build a model of the place where you work, and you could go there beforehand and learn how to navigate where to go for HR and things before. You could even make a game of it in a scavenger hunt. I've actually, seen people do that with mobile devices instead. You have to wander around and given clues and figure out where things are, and you can make it fun. Yeah, Stella, you attended a PowerPoint in Second Life. Yes, people were doing that, and we still wonder why. But oh, I see sarcasm. It wasn't marvelous. There was a lot of extraneous load, is what I'm now inferring you meant, Prakar. Yes. Yeah. And the question is this useful to carry forward? And I'm going to suggest it is. So, I'm going to start with media. And this is, tied to, well, I don't want to pre-color. I just want you to think, what do you think of as media? Clue, if I put a question in the middle of the screen, that's typically a question for you all. Any tangible support that provides information? That's a very generic one. What forms does that support take that can provide information? Are there, and audio, video, graphics? Yeah. Video, audio tapes? Yeah. And, I maybe have not framed the question well enough. Still images, video, graphics, and text are all, to me, media that presented information. Yes, it has to be has to be able to be perceptually detected, which is why accessibility is such an important component. If you haven't perceived it, it didn't happen. You need to have perceived it. One-to-many and many-to-many communication. Well, all of these can be to an individual, but I am sort of focusing more at the sort of perceptual level. I'll confess, and I've left this probably too open. It brings messages across. Yes, it definitely is a method of communication for media. So what dimensions do media vary on? And Stella was thinking about one-to-many or many-to-many communication. Heather was breaking it down into sort of perceptual levels. Sophie was talking about it, semantic content. And Claire was mentioning, similarly, semantic or message communication. It has goal beyond the transfer of information. I think when you aggregate the messages in a media or across media, it may have a goal higher, but many times it's just, to me, the transfer of information. I don't understand the second question exactly, Claire. That's what I'm trying to work on in terms of thinking of affordances, or what are their fundamental capabilities? What differentiates video from still images? What differentiates video from audio? What differentiates audio from text? And that's the type of analysis I think it really helps us to do. And again, I warned you at the beginning, this could be pedantic, it's kind of a deep analysis. And yet I think when you do this fundamental analysis, it reveals important things for the design of learning, the cognitive input. Well, yeah, I think indeed it's the cognitive form. So when I think about this, I think about, to me, pictures are static, video is dynamic. Now, I have to be clear when I talk about video, video can incorporate a number of things, but I'm specifically thinking about moving context. The sensory channel is a visual, auditory, kinesthetic. Is it coming to and from the learner or the instructor? These are different dimensions that can differentiate the learning role or the cognitive role of media. So how do you come at this? How do you get there? In one sense, it's the perceptual channel. We could go auditory and olfactory olfactory and there must be a word for taste that I don't even know. By and large, we don't use those as communication tools. If you're teaching something like sommelier, you then get into smell and taste as well. We don't have good ways to do that digitally. We have bad ways to do it digitally. There were some early experiments in this that were suspect at best, shall we say. But overall, this isn't how we want to do it. So, but we want to break it up and think explicitly about the cognitive properties of media for the purposes of determining when to use each. And to me, that's an important distinction. So I have thought about it this way. To me, a real photo of something or a real video of some live context communicates context. And there are times when context is important. That is when you really need to see what it looks like. For instance, in learning, examples may need to show context. Practice may need to show context for you to infer the context. Cognitively, our brains put together the context we're in and what we've learned together, and what it comes out is emergent understanding. In general, for learning, we're trying to get people to perform reliably in different contexts so you can deal with different customers and still maintain your cool, right? So we might want to show different contexts and then abstract the underlying concepts. So concepts, graphics, like diagrams, this is a concept. This is a concept diagram, right? It's a graphic or a design. If I made it dynamic, it would then be an animation. To me, an animation, I don't mean cartoon type animations. I mean animated diagrams, things changing over time. Linguistically, text is static, speech is dynamic. We'll cover later the relationships between these, but knowing about them and analyzing from this role helps us understand when something is dynamic. Trying to watch something and read the associated text doesn't work. Now, we can put in subtitles, particularly when language is different or the auditory is different, but many times hearing speech while watching something is important. There's another principle that actually isn't in this thing, I'm haven't explicitly referenced it in the previous or this slide, and I don't have it referenced anywhere explicitly on a slide. Visual is direction specific. If it's happening behind me, I don't notice it. Unless it makes a sound. Sound is not direction specific. It's distance specific, but it's not direction specific. So if you need to have your attention focus on something and you want to communicate additional information, putting it in the video, blocking you to present that information isn't a viable way to go about it. We can do sort of heads-up displays, which is one of the reasons I think augmented reality is really interesting. So heads-up display, we can put it in places where it doesn't interfere, but also audio. Why does your GPS talk you through the stages so that you don't have to take your eyes off the road if there's a reason you shouldn't take your eyes off the road and you can still get the information? We're doing this direction-free channel to not interfere with this directionary channel. And I don't think we think necessarily about audio enough. You could be talking somebody through something. Why couldn't we have, a little narrative continue going on while you're doing something? We always worry about trying to put it in your vision. And I don't think we use auditory enough, but that's a personal belief, and I think people may be doing it. So that was my original breakup. And I think there are times when you can switch between these. Again, I'll mention that later. But I think it's important to understand that if you want to convey concepts, you use diagrams. When you want to convey context, you use photo. And if you're doing it statically, you can use text to augment it. Although cognitive load says, have the text integrated with the graphic. Don't make you have, A, B, C, D in the graphic, and then you have to go over here and read it what A, B, C, D means. That adds to the cognitive load. Put the labels in the diagram somehow. I'm going to complicate this a little bit, and then we'll pause to see if there's any questions. I believe we way underuse graphic novel formats. And we're seeing a fair amount of people using cartoon characters now because they made it easy with things like Powtoon. So you can have characters and you can give them scripts and they can interact. But what is their cognitive role? How do they work? Well, interestingly, and sometimes you can put them on, have those characters move against a background of a real photo. So you are getting the context. But I think they're semi-conceptual and semi-contextual. And that's one of the reasons I think they're valuable. Comics also are low bandwidth. I'll talk about comics first and then I'll jump to cartoons. But comics are low bandwidth. They don't require as much data to communicate as does a photo. They are easily internationalizable and localizable because most countries have cultural literacy of comics as part of their understanding. And as long as you give 1.5 times the amount of space you require for English in your thought bubbles and speech bubbles, you can accommodate pretty much any language. So you can easily, translate it. And they're inexpensive to develop, relatively speaking. They're easy to edit and change. And people, and they remove some of the context, so it makes it easier for the learner to perceive themselves in that role, because there's less specifics, although there's also some benefit to first-person view versus third-person view. Animating that with a cartoon, lower bandwidth than video, editable, because typically you have, you don't use real audio voice, you use computer-generated voice, which is getting so good now that you really, it's hard. There's still reasons to use voice talent. I'm not an expert on voice talent, but do that. Comics also work really well with target learners with low literary skill. Indeed, you can, and you can provide visual clues that help, icons and things to help them identify things. When we did the game for kids who grew up, who at age 18 are thrown out in the streets and didn't know how to survive. So we created a game where they could practice learning the skills of surviving. These kids are low literacy. And indeed, we would have at the fish and chip shop, there would be a picture of a fish, right? They could quickly identify and figure out what things are. Good point, Stella. Thank you very much for that. So I put comics and cartoons in there as they can be used to convey concept. I still think they're more contextual. They actually show how the concept plays out in context, but you can do interesting things. So you can show the underlying thinking with the thought bubble. In dynamics, you can do it with the echoing voice. I wondered what I was doing here. But still, each of these has a role they can play in communicating, and knowing what you need to communicate gives you a choice on how to use these media appropriately. So that's sort of, I realize, as I apologized before, it's slightly pedantic analysis, but I think it's important to think about, and then we'll talk about blending a bit later. Any questions on that before we move on? No? Okay, good. I appreciate that, Heather. I hope it's useful. All right, now we're going to talk about devices. I should have put blending later in the deck, but I didn't. So, earlier in the deck, but I didn't. I added it at the end, so we'll go back. But that way we're revisiting, so we're getting sort of spiral curriculum, right? That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So what do you consider a device? Visual harvesting, it's a mix between cartoonish and text. I don't know visual harvesting.
It's a situation where when there is a session going on, when someone is, during the session, someone else is making a drawing on what's been said or being discussed. And then in the end, you have this canvas with all the content and the icons on it of the reflection process, for example. Yeah.
Right. I think that's useful, specifically for people who heard the talk, to reactivate it. I don't know how much it helps. Now, I started mind mapping keynotes for me because I had trouble listening, because if I wasn't doing anything with my hands, if I had free cognitive, it'd say something interesting, my mind would go away and follow that thought. By the time I came back, I'd lost the plot. So I started mind mapping it as overhead and using that extra stuff, the process of structuring what they were saying and trying to find the relationships and map it was enough cognitive overhead that it kept my mind from running away and kept my focus on what they were saying. I started just posting those to the web, to my blog, because it was something I could post to the blog. They were some of my most visited posts, interestingly. But as somebody pointed out, Stephen Downs actually said, yeah, but they don't help somebody who wasn't at that lecture. And that's right. It's much harder to make sense of it. But for people who did visit, it's a good reactivation. And I've gone back and looked at some of mine from time to time to see what somebody said who I was going to go hear again or finally have a conversation with. But so I think visual facilitation is a nice takeaway. It's a reactivation to me of what you saw, which is a good thing in terms of helping you process it and retain it. But I wanted to move on and talk about computational devices. When we're talking about educational technology, we'll talk about platforms next week. But this week, what do you consider to be a device? What sort of devices do you have around you now? What sort of device are you observing this with right now? A laptop, said Sophie. Desktop, it's Heather. A cell phone, okay. Multiple monitors, yeah. I actually have a laptop connected up to a big monitor. Usually when I do presentations, I use the laptop camera, but for the sake of this conference, I'm just letting you see straight from the big monitor because I want us to be a little bit more casual. Good old wired phone, oh my, yes. I finally got rid of ours when I realized it was costing us a lot of money and it wasn't doing, all it was getting was spam. Audio recorder? Oh, okay, yeah. Any automated computational piece of technology that we interact with? Yeah, bring up an interesting point there, Raspberry Pi. Cool. There are lots of technologies we can use. Chalk and blackboards are technology, whiteboards are technology, voice is a technology. But specifically, one of the reasons we went to digital technologies is twofold. I said one of the reasons is twofold. The reasons are at least twofold. One is that they're sort of the ultimately programmable partner. They can be lots of different things because they're not a fixed, chalk is only good for writing on blackboards with you. If we have, functional fixedness. The wired phone, as you mentioned, Sophie, is good for audio. It can't do much more unless you connect it to a modem and then it becomes a channel for communication. So it's channel for communication. But a computer can be many different things. It can be visual support. It can be auditory support. It can be programmed to be lots of things. And specifically, it does things well that our brains don't. And vice versa. Our brains are pattern matchers and meaning making. We're really bad at remembering arbitrary and rote and large amounts of information. Digital technology is the opposite. So we couple it with us. And now we've come up with multiple form factors. In fact, really there's continuum. So I really want to ask, what dimensions do devices vary on? So again, dimensions, what characterizes the difference between these devices? And size is definitely one of the things. I'm sure your desktop is quite a bit bigger than my cell phone. Portability, absolutely. Processing speed, yes, that does, although again, that's even more of a continuum. For certain things, having a powerful processor, I upgraded my laptop and suddenly my time to process video dropped significantly. Not that it was too big before, it was 10 minutes, now it's 2 minutes, it's that big. But I want to talk about some other dimensions. So mobility, as you mentioned, Claire, but also the resolution, the size of the screen, and is it color or not? Kindles are still black and white, or they can be. You can choose to get black. Also, the way you interact with it. Do you touch the screen or using a keyboard or a pointer? And how frequency, what's the typical pattern of use? And that one to me is interesting, and we'll get there. But so just thinking about these dimensions again helps break it up and thinks about what makes sense for them in particular types. So we have a whole range of devices now, everything from watches and glasses that kind of went away, but they're supposed to be coming back, phones, tablets, laptops, desktops. It used to be that we had, just desktops and laptops, and then we got phones, and we got tablets, and now it's pretty much a continuum with all of these things. But I think it's interesting and important to think, well, for one question, what's mobile? Is there a distinction, a fundamental distinction that determines when it's mobile and when it's not? And is that important? And I'll actually suggest, don't forget Google Home, Alexa. Interesting, you're right. And that's another issue then. So your interaction modality, going back to the previous diagram, you also have voice, right? So you have touchscreen, keyboard, pointer, or voice as control. And indeed, if you are wearing, you could have I think, didn't they just retire the last iPod? But it was just a digital device. So what's mobile? I think the boundary is blurring between mobile and other devices. It is. I still have 3 iPods. Good for you. And I have now put my music on my iPhone, and I carry it with me because I haven't got a watch or glasses yet. But I actually, because my second and third books were on mobile, I thought a lot about this, and I finally come up with a distinction I think to me is important, and I'll make a caveat on it afterwards. But to me, a mobile device is one that is naturally used standing or walking. When you're mobile, it's naturally usable that way. That, for me, by the way, distinguishes why a laptop is not mobile. Everything else, watch, glasses, phone, tablet, they're all mobile. You would think a laptop is too, but it's not. You can hold it and touch and, hold it underneath and touch and stuff, but you're not using it naturally. What it is a portable desktop. It's not a mobile. Now, I mentioned there's a caveat. That caveat is when it's being used for something specific to where you are. So I do this with it here and that with it there, then the context matters, and then it becomes mobile. But in general, to me, it's a naturally usable. Even a tablet, you can hold this way and it's still using the same touchscreen. It's made to use, be held in one hand and used with the other. A laptop's not that. So that's my distinction. It's very pragmatic. It's less principled, but I think it's right. So you're welcome to agree. Can you use it without being plugged into a wall? Yeah, although my laptop can be used for a long time without being plugged into a wall, supposedly all day. Supposed to have 10 hours. And can it be used without being plugged into a network? It would be perhaps another issue, is it have Wi-Fi. My laptop does not have an Ethernet port anymore, which is sometimes a concern, but there we go. So I found this many, many, many years ago. Remember the Palm Pilot? I thought I didn't get the first generation. I wanted it, but I didn't have a use case. I'm kind of like, I don't buy technology until I know exactly how it's going to make me more productive. That's why when I first heard of the iPad, I wasn't going to buy it. By the time it was released, got one on the first day. That's because between the time it was announced and the time it was realized, I realized how I was going to use it. In fact, the first business trip I took after getting it, I didn't bring a laptop. I did everything with my iPad, which was kind of cool. But way before then was the Palm. And before that was the Newton. And Apple really tried to make a mobile device that worked, but they made something wrong. They tried to make the computer recognize your handwriting. That was trying to make the computer do pattern matching, meaning making. And it's really hard to do that. What Palm got right is figured out a hybrid language that was like English, but that the computer could easily distinguish between, so it didn't have it to it. But once it was successful, and there's a whole nother story about how Jeff Hawkins ran around with a wood prototype and asked himself every time and everything he was doing, how it would make himself more productive. And then he came up with those 4 core functionalities: notes, calendar, to-dos, and contacts, address book. Those 4 things, and that essentially made the Palm Pilot successful. The 4 things and getting it right. There were a few other things that were critical. Had to have the battery to last all day. Had to be absolutely foolproof. If you put something in it so you didn't have to put it in your brain, but it wasn't there at the end of the day when you synced it back up, oh, that was another thing. It had to sync with the rest of your environment. But getting all that right made it succeed. But after they were successful, they wanted to help developers create apps. You know, there were app stores before the iPhone, okay? And they analyzed what differed, and they wrote a really cute paper that I still recommend, by the way, for thinking about, called The Zen of Palm. And it was analyzed what differed between mobile and lap and other computing solutions. And this one to me was really critical, because what they found out is that laptops and desktops, you sit down, you work for hours you only take several times a day, but you spend large amounts of time. Whereas a mobile device, you tended to pull out very frequently, use very brief point of time, and put away. And that to me is a fundamental dimension, a way of thinking about it that really helps differentiate what you're doing. And in fact, I went further, and when I was thinking about the time scale and the size of it, I realized, a watch is really for quick glancing at and putting away. You might do a little bit more, but it's not for minutes even. A phone, and I started talking about wearable, packable, and pocketable. The phone isn't just for quick glances. You tend to pull it up and open it and do something, but then you put it away. You get the information you need, you get it. You might have a call that's slightly differently. I'm thinking more of the sort of the digital uses, but then you put away. Okay, granted, there are people who seem to be on the phone all the time. I don't know who they have to talk to for that long. But that's not me. But the tablet tends to be used closer to a laptop. It's really not designed for quick pulling out. It doesn't afford that. It's too big. You pull it out and do things with it. I believe e-learning may make sense on a tablet. I really don't want courses on a phone, with a caveat. I'm in the US, and in other countries like Australia and the UK and maybe Belgium, it makes sense. In China and India, many times the only device they have that connects to the internet is their phone. They tend to have the bigger phones. Their courses on a phone may make sense when you have a commute where you have the dedicated time, but it's not my normal thinking. Yes, graffiti writing, that was a big breakthrough, Stella. So Any questions on that before we move on? Because we're going to go to the final topic for today. We're all good? All right. So I talked about the different properties of media, but there's something to be also considered here. So if we have video, that's great. Video is wonderful, but you can also get the equivalent of video by showing a sequence of static pictures and having an audio narration. Ken Burns' The Civil War series was a deeply immersive experience, and it didn't have video. It had static images. And you can show a series of static images and narrate it and get effectively the equivalent of a video, unless it's really specifically, you need to see specific transitions. And even then you can really emphasize it. And you can go further, even static images, and text. I don't know where the text went. There was text there. Can approximate the same thing. So the point being that you should use the right media for the message. So if you need dynamic context, you should use video. But if I have a mantra, we talked in the session yesterday about mantras. Well, I have a whole bunch of quips, Quinn quips. Go look at LearnLit's quips and you'll find one of them is, if you get the design right, there are lots of ways to implement it. If you don't get the design right, it doesn't matter how you implement it. And the point is, ideally, but if you have reasons why video is hard to get, or you need it to be editable or needs to be updatable really fast, it frequently changes, it may make more sense to use a sequence of static images that you can swap the images out rather than refilm the whole thing. So first figure out what you need them to consume. And we haven't even talked about interactivity here, except a little bit about touchscreen versus keyboard interaction. And recently it was made really clear how important interactivity is in what we do, which probably should have been one of my topics. I'll see if I have space to work it in one of the subsequent weeks. But interactivity is critical. But the point being, figure out what you need and then see if you can't do it the ideal way, for a number of pragmatic reasons, consider other ways that give you the flexibility you need and yet still maintain a lot of the power that happens. Don't be tied to one methodology, and do think about accessibility. If you're having an audio, should you have a text version for people who have trouble hearing? Might make sense. People often don't think about maintainability, scalability, and the ability to repurpose the interaction. Good point, Stella. Indeed. I talk a lot when we talk about content systems, which is next week. I should also mention content management is a really important, critical thing that we don't think enough about, and we should. I always ask this, how many of you have on your LMS content that's out of date and is still hanging around there? And most everybody raises their hand, right? It's because you don't have a content management process that includes dates and responsibilities for reviewing it, determining if it needs to be kept as is, updated, or turfed. That's part of the process. And Megan says, I reasonably stuffed that up and had senior leaders mention dates in the video, so we can't reuse. Good point. Yes, exactly. I feel for you. That's and yet a valuable lesson, and yet one that's difficult. I do yearly cleanup and nag content hours. Good for you, Claire. That's content management. Now, it's better if it's systematized, so you don't have to nag. You can make a system automatically nag them, and somebody has responsibility to make them actually do it, but it's better than nothing. So good on you. Absolutely. So second to the last question, previous buildings we moved. Yeah, some of that stuff is easy to change and other stuff is more challenging. Absolutely. What have I forgot to cover that you would like to, not going standards platforms or the mashups, the way we apply them going on, but anything here? I ask that also when I talk to people in stores or my doctor or things, What have I forgot to ask?
Can I ask a question, Clark?
Absolutely.
I would love to hear more your thoughts on what do you think about the emerging tech? Like you mentioned, the AI and VR and blockchain and all that, and the affordance. Like, what are the opportunities of the affordance there?
Right. And AI is next session, and AR and VR in the final session. But briefly, I think we're seeing the same sort of phenomena that people are overgeneralizing, trying to use it in ways that don't naturally fit. We are seeing PowerPoint presentations in VR now, and lots of experiments of things that VR doesn't really need to be used. I actually think we kind of underexplore AR so far. I think we haven't, partly that's because it's still difficult. We have lots of separate platforms that don't interoperate. We haven't created standards. Standards are good when, when people actually adhere to them. So I don't know about you, but it is now 2022, and we still have things that only work in one browser and not in another. Kill me. That's extremely frustrating because supposedly we have web standards, but when we get things working well and make it easy so that, but right now some of the, the headsets are still expensive. The tools to do AR are some challenging, difficult. Some things are easy, Eris, but actually recognizing what you're looking at, that sort of recognition and alignment is hard. You have to put in codes in the world, which isn't a bad thing, but it kind of clutters the world. So I still think we're on the verge. And AI, I think our biggest problem is the hype around AI. Everybody's already scared about artificial general intelligence. We're nowhere near that. We're nowhere near that. We have very siloed bits of things that they can do, but they're very brittle at the edges. There's great potential for carving up content, but even that, when you listen to the people who do this stuff speak honestly, they'll tell you, oh, but we have to start with really good content. People really have to write good content for our auto parsing to work. That's my quick take. We'll dig into it a lot more in subsequent sessions. Well, we're getting near the end. So the other question is, what readings do you want to have recommended? What readings are, what would you like to have? It occurs to me, I should probably, how do I make a to-do without using my screen, which I'm using for presenting? I am going to make the Zen of Palm available to you, because I think that's just a really cool read. For newcomers, here's 60 minutes to do this, 50 minutes in. Where's the button menu to start this? Yeah. Classic case. Yeah, the learning overhead is a real barrier. And then I was a reviewer on a journal submission. I've stopped doing that now, but they had a VR version of an experience and a non-VR regular computer version, and they didn't find any significant advantage for the VR version. And that actually was one that you thought it might have been plausible. So let me make right here, put Zen of Palm. And if I do find a good affordances discussion, I presume I will ask Esther afterwards that we have a way to put things available on a website that you can download them, so I don't have to email them to you individually. And I will make out. When trying to plan a VR party for my son, yes. Hi, Siri, start the session. Yes, I'm being dizzy being in VR for too long. That's still a problem too. That was a problem years ago that's supposed to get much better, and yet some people still have it. A lot of HCI research on affordance. Yes, there is. But I really wanted, what I'm looking for is the Reader's Digest condensed introduction to affordance. And when I did that, that's when I realized I've taken it in a direction that's a little bit different than what they mean. So I'm not sure if there's a good discussion of that. If there isn't, maybe I'll have to write a blog post on it if I haven't already. Well, that's it. We're open for any further questions. Otherwise, we're coming close to the end time. And I hope you found this interesting, valuable. I realize it's kind of pedantic, but I think when, this is sort of advanced track stuff, not basic track stuff. And I think this sort of thinking is something we need to do more of. And so that's where I'm at. No, oh, good, Heather. Thank you. Thank you all. Good. Yes, definitely different. It's not your standard conference presentation. I've got nothing to sell you. I just want us to do better at what we do. Cool. Great. Well, I will send you off. You're welcome to leave. You're welcome to stick around and ask questions. I will stop the recording at the top of the hour, and then we'll go on and hope to see you around.
Thank you, Clark. We'll see you next week. Same time, couple of mornings next week, by the looks of it.
Yeah, that's the plan.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing how it moves through into the next stage.
Yep. And enjoy your day. I know you're just starting, so.
Yes, I'm going to get the kids off the TV now and get them ready for school.
Now I feel like I see you guys every day.
I know. I saw you yesterday. I think, what was that? What time did we do that yesterday? It was like 11 a.m. Yeah, it's 7 a.m. here now. So it's the beginning of the day. Time for breakfast.
Oh, you're keen. You're up early.
And Prakar's up even earlier then because she's in Adelaide. So
you're
in
Adelaide.
6:30 here, but thank you so much, Clark.
Yeah, this is awesome. I have an HCI background, so this is music to my ears, and I'm so happy you take on this direction. It's needed. Like, I think we, as a community, definitely need to talk more about it. I also want to ask, have you read anything by Neil Postman? He was a communication professor back in the 80s, I think, Ohio State University. He wrote, the most common one is Amusing Ourselves to Death, TV, critical theory, but he also wrote a book called Technopoly, like Monopoly, Technopoly, and his critical look, critical look on technology, and he talks about like who is technology serving, and to who does it benefit, and what do we sacrifice in the process of it. So really love that too.
I haven't read him. I read.
I'm gonna let you guys
stuff.
go. Thank you.
Oh, yep. No worries, Megan. Have a good day.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff. I didn't know you had an HCI background. I didn't have an HCI background. I had an ed tech background, but where I did my PhD, the whole lab was focused on HCI. And in fact, afterwards, I was hired at a university to teach HCI simply because Don was my PhD advisor. So anybody who's a student, Don's can teach HCI. So I ended up, and it's that focus on performance and usability has stuck with me. What's really stuck with me is the focus, what they think, HCI was way ahead of ed tech in terms of design practice.
Yes.
Yeah.
When I went into ed tech, I was like, I can't believe people don't look at HCI research.
Well, in fact, that's what I did a lot of when I was an academic, a lot of my talks were taking HCI ideas and bringing it to the ed tech community.
I still do that. It's human computer interaction, in case you're wondering what we're saying.
Right. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. That was sort of the predecessor to UX. Actually, they have both. I'm not quite sure how they think they completely differ, but
no. And I felt like UX kind of move it even kind of more further away from the context. I think HCI is more the umbrella term. It is more holistic look. And UX, sometimes people get really focused on really just UI, isn't it? So.
Yeah.